Okay, so hello and welcome to the Mediating Scale Conference. My name is Oliver Kenny, and together with Magdalena Krysztoforska, I am delighted to be hosting this event. I look forward to what is promising to be a very exciting 3 days of brilliant presentations and discussions. Our ambition with this conference was to bring together scholars who engage with the problem of scale and to reflect on how scalar thinking should orient our visions towards the future. We are extremely proud to be welcoming 6 keynotes who are some of the leading thinkers in this area and whose work moves beyond traditional disciplinary boundaries and beyond the mesoscale of the human. We also have 5 fantastic panels, and I see some of the panelists are joining us right now, so thank you very much. And they will be showcasing a broad spectrum of approaches to the challenge of mediating scale. I hope that you'll be able to join us for as many of these illuminating and exciting papers as possible. Just before we start, I would like to give my sincere thanks to the Institute of Communication Studies, where I'm a lecturer, who is hosting and financing this conference. In particular, I'd like to thank Piero Tioshi, director of the Institute, and also Mehdi Gassimi, director of research here, who has worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help make this event a success. Before we begin our first keynote, some quick housekeeping. As you may have noticed on joining, this session is being recorded. After the main presentation, we will have roughly half an hour for a discussion. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to put as many of them as we can to our speaker. Please try to formulate your questions concisely, and please make sure to use the Q&A function for your questions rather than the chat feature. So without further ado, let me introduce our first keynote. So Zachary Horton is a media, literary, and environmental scholar, as well as a filmmaker, photographer, and camera designer. He is assistant professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh. His academic research primarily focuses on the relationship between scale, ecology, and technological mediation. His first book is The Cosmic Zoom: Scale, Knowledge, and Mediation, which came out last year with the University of Chicago Press. And if you look in this part of the Zoom events, you'll find that the first chapter is available to download, as well as being available on his website, where he also gives some extra information to help you work out how to access and read through the book in different ways. His current research focuses on the early history of video games, tabletop games, and climate mediation. Today, the title of his talk is Resolving Difference, a Medial Theory of Scale. So, Zach, it's over to you. I'll let you share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, Oliver. Also, Magdalena and the Institute of Communication Studies for hosting this. This is incredibly exciting. What a wonderful, amazing gathering of scholars. I just couldn't be happier. The only thing that would have been better is if this could have happened 5 years ago when I was researching this book. But anyway, I'm really honored to be here and really excited to hear what the rest of you to hear about your interests in scale and your research. So looking greatly forward to the rest of this conference, and happy to kick us off here. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so I particularly wanted to emphasize how excited I am about all of your work on scale that we're going to hear about, because I'm about to say this. We live in an age of scale mania. We never stop hearing about scale. Scaling products and services, the scales of pandemics, scaling government programs, surveillance scale, the scale of big data, algorithmic scale, the scale of climate change and climate futures, the scales of microprocessor engineering, bioengineering, and nanotechnology. but also viral media, the scale of our social media networks, clicks, links, friends, followers, subs. We're obsessed with crossing scalar thresholds. We're giddy with scale. Part of this is unprecedented access to other scales, right? This is one of the drivers. New forms of microscopy and molecular engineering, database-driven media, and massively scaling algorithms. Deep learning AI and metadata surveillance, climate models, and instruments like the James Webb Space Telescope all give us at least the perception of direct access to other scales. In a very real sense, we've incorporated the multiscalar into our identities and are proud of that fact. Even when it comes back to bite us, as with viral transmission along our multiscalar networks. Scale is not only bound up in our everyday identities, but also our imagined futures. This is how politics has become scalar politics. How to characterize the range of scales we can access, who gains access to which scales, and what assemblages at what scales are accorded agency. These are some of the most important questions for scalar politics. But even though we're obsessed with scale, form our identities around it, have unprecedented access to other scales, and engage a political arena of scale, we are terrible at theorizing scale itself. In my book, The Cosmic Zoom, I analyze this opacity of scale itself as a missing center between the scalar protocols of disciplined knowledge production and the objects that appear as scaled through the lenses of particular disciplines. This is a diagram from the book, and basically and I think this would actually make more sense as we go along here, but what I'm trying to show here is that we have two kinds of scale that we normally talk about. One is the scale of objects, and the scale of objects is actually only measurable, only conceptualizable, only approachable through the lens of discipline, right? Which is to say disciplined knowledge structures, whether they're formalized or informal. And disciplines provide that kind of filter through which the scale of objects becomes visible, right? The sort of comparative framework that is required in order to understand or see the scale of objects becomes visible. That's what I'm calling scale O here, which is the scale of objects, right? But on the other hand, we can, as scholars, as critical thinkers, analyze the scale of our knowledge structures, right? And that's what I'm calling scale D, disciplinary scale, right? We can investigate scale D by looking at the protocols and the assumptions that undergird our actual disciplinary forms of knowledge. What I'm arguing is that scale itself falls somewhere in between these two different forms of scale that we're used to talking about, that we know how to talk about, right? Scale O and scale D. Somehow scale itself gets lost between those things. This is one of the animating questions or dynamics that led me to this study. Right? Is it possible to talk about scale itself? What does that mean? I call it in the book primary scale. Right? Scale itself I call primary scale. And I'm happy to discuss this at more length later in the Q&A. I don't want to bog us down here too much, but what I do want to do instead is give us right now a concrete example of scale articulated to possible futures. The example comes by way of Elon Musk, right? And so this is an evocation of the scale of Mars colonization from the SpaceX website. The road to making humanity multiplanetary. So I want to think about this splash page for a moment. This is a large scale goal, right? Transforming humanity into a multiplanetary species. It represents a scalar jump. A single planet species expands to multiple planets, multiple orbits, a significant swath of the solar system. Really then, this isn't about Mars. After all, Mars is diminutive in relation to Earth, right? It's actually a slightly smaller planet. Um, Living there wouldn't involve a scale change really at all. The scale change is conceptual. We may come to see ourselves as somehow grander because the scale of our domain will be much larger than that of our ancestors, right? Um, and the other element I want to notice here is the figure of the road, which I find really interesting, right? The road to making humanity. It's an unlikely metaphor for scale change, right? Especially one that requires radically new forms of transportation, right? Roads are not only terrestrial, but linear. The overall image then is of a linear transformation across scalar boundaries. I want to mentally bookmark that point because we're going to come back to that. When we scroll down on this same website, we get a larger quote. You want to wake up in the morning and think the future is going to be great. And that's what being a spacefaring civilization is all about. It's about believing in the future and thinking that the future will be better than the past. And I can't think of anything more exciting than going out there and being among the stars. Elon Musk. All right, so this quote explicitly links Mars colonization with optimism and implicitly casts it as an antidote to declensionism. Right? The climate future that awaits us on Earth, disillusionment at seemingly implacable classicism, racism, and nationalism. Right? The inevitable horror show of our algorithmic destiny. Here's something we can be excited about. And I don't want to discount the importance, if you can sense I'm being a bit sarcastic here, I actually don't want to discount the importance of things to be excited about. We do need things to be excited about, right? We might note, however, that as this illustration on this page makes clear, this is a decidedly 1950s vision of an exciting future, right? Musk has devoted his life to building Robert Heinlein's future. Being among the stars connotes a cosmic perspective, but contains a scalar dysmorphia. Is being on Mars being among the stars in a way that being on Earth isn't? Existing within a galaxy of stars is indeed an awe-inspiring scale to contemplate, but it's wholly unaffected by planetary location within a single solar system. Right? So there's a scalar collapse here. Mars and the galaxy are somehow conflated, and travel within one scale is speculatively figured as another scale entirely, the galactic. This is a medial affordance, the ability to simultaneously figure two or more scales, mashing them together on one medial surface, where the differential dynamics of those scales can be conflated with their individual media surface, where the differential dynamics, where the characteristics are transferred between one another. This is the fundamental tool of scalar politics. But to understand how it works, we need a theory of scalar mediation. For me, the first articulation, the first dividing line for scale theory is the ontological question of scale. Is scale an arbitrary rhetorical construction, or is it a fundamental feature of the universe, irrespective of human perspective, conceptualization, or experience? If there were no humans with their wacky ideas, would there still be scale? This is a fiercely debated topic in many social science disciplines. But in general, the modern consensus in the natural sciences is that scale is a fundamental feature of reality. On the other hand, the modern consensus in the humanities is that scale is an arbitrary construct. And honestly, this makes sense. What is a scale but a conventional understanding of a particular domain of activity? Isn't the national scale produced by rhetoric, legal fictions, shared or hegemonic narratives, border disputes, and wars? Isn't the individual an equally fictitious set of forces and assemblages bounded by convention? So it is for all scales. Each is an arbitrary slice of reality, conventionally bounded and subject to revision. And yet, I think it's deeply wrong to suggest that scale is invented by humans alone. In fact, as scientific investigation has repeatedly shown, no two scales are alike. Different dynamics pertain to each different scale. Life can only exist at certain scales. Gravity only matters at certain scales. Mass only pertains at certain scales. These are pretty fundamental aspects of reality. The scaleless world of Isaac Newton, where a falling apple and a celestial body behave in exactly the same way, simply doesn't exist. The cosmos is fundamentally scaled. And this would be true if no human had ever existed to think the concept, or at least that's what I'm arguing. Certainly not alone. In other words, as I argue in the book, scalar difference is perhaps the most fundamental difference that exists. I argue that no other difference would be possible without scale. But here, I'm not going to bog us down with intensive versus extensive difference or primary versus secondary scale, right? I'm happy to talk about that, or you can read the book if you want to wade deep into the weeds on those particular questions. What I want to argue, though, is that it's simultaneously true that scale exists as ontological difference and as arbitrary construct. This is possible because scalar difference is a dynamic of mediation. I call this the circuit of scalar mediation. And it doesn't matter where you start on the circuit, but the process, I'm arguing, goes like this. Scalar difference animates the cosmos, but when one pocket of matter energy encounters another, it makes what I call a resolving cut. It forms a relationship with something else, an environment or an entity or whatever we wish to call it. And I'm drawing on Karen Barad's work here in the notion of the cut. And what I'm arguing is that this is a fundamentally scalar form of differentiation. As this relationship is stabilized through some process of exchange, mediation, that is to say the relationship between two different segments of matter energy, which exist fundamentally at always different scales, right? As a scale is stabilized as a set of relationships, the sensing assemblage measures its difference from that of another surface. And this difference is scalar. Any assemblage can stabilize a scale, but that's what we do. I mean, that is not as an exception. We do this just like any other sort of scaled entity can do this. And we do it whenever we narrate a nation into or out of existence, or posit my body as myself, or watch an ultrasound image of a fetus inside a uterus, or perform an ecological study on a marshland, or take a COVID-19 test, or thrill to Elon Musk talk about trans-Mars injection. Every resolving cut produces an arbitrary, though often shared, boundary or field of view. This is what will be included, and this is what won't. The resulting surface in its generic form becomes a scale that others can resolve, right? It's shared. This is how we form disciplines, to harken back to that previous diagram. Every act of resolution stabilizes a scale by making a cut in what I call the scalar spectrum. And I'm calling this, call it the scalar spectrum rather than the universe or reality or a collection of all scales, because it's already virtually differentiated, but not yet stabilized into particular scales. And I think that ontological status is really important to me. Right? I want to emphasize that it contains all virtual difference. The scalar spectrum contains all virtual difference, but it isn't organized into distinct domains. Right? It requires internal differentiation to organize into separate domains, even though it virtually contains all difference already. Right? It contains all potential scales, but requires cutting in order to produce relationships. Those relationships are scalar relationships between stabilized, conventionalized scales. Okay, but what's really surprising is that once we've produced a resolving cut and stabilized a scale, new features of reality emerge, they bubble up. We resolve what I call ecological detail whenever we encounter another scale through this form of mediation. In other words, available structure or differential detail is made accessible through the occlusion of other detail. This is why, even if resolving cuts are arbitrary, ecological detail is not. Right? And this is the scalar paradox, that a stabilization of a relationship between what become stabilized scales is required in order for us to access the ecological detail was already fundamentally there, right? But that ecological detail is itself independent ontologically of the scalar stabilization. That's my ontological argument in a nutshell, and that's what I call the paradox of scale. Okay, so the difference that emerges is not produced by or controllable by us. In fact, it can and frequently does disrupt the very stabilized knowledge structures that made the resolving cut in the first place. I like to say that we make scales, but scale unmakes us. This then is my solution to the scalar paradox, right? But to illustrate it more concretely, I want to turn to one of the greatest medial explorations of scale itself. A book I want to look at physically rather than as a set of slides, so I'm going to temporarily end my screen sharing. So that I can give you this. Okay, so this book is Cosmic View, a 1957 book by Krysztoforska, a Dutch educator. And many of you probably already know this book. If you don't, please get a copy of it. It tells the story of Boca's experimental school, the Werkplatz. And this is a story in and of itself, which I go into in the book. It's quite interesting and maybe worthy of some further discussion in the Q&A if you like. Okay, so the text. Let me get the right page here. There's quite a bit of introductory text in this book, but the real scalar fireworks start with this first image in these cosmic jumps. All right. Okay, so this is an image of an actual Werkplatz student sitting in the school courtyard. The text under the image tells us about the school and student and her cat and explains the scalar relationship between the page of the book and the image. The actual girl and area represented by the photograph is 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters square. On the printed page of the book, the corresponding image is 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters square. And as the text explains, this means that the scale is 1 to 10. And the important, I mean, this is a basic explanation of scale, right? It couldn't be more basic, but for me, the important and surprising thing here is that this is a precise material relationship. The book I'm holding bears this material relationship with the girl and the cat and the courtyard. The representational apparatus of the book is self-reflexively articulated as a scalar dynamic. Boca emphasizes the relationship between resolution and scale already by the second page, right here, which reveals at a scale of 1 to 100 that a giant whale is also present in the courtyard, lying just outside of the scalar boundaries of the original image. Right? This is also a great scalar joke. As we jump to ever greater scales, more and more context for the Werkplatz is revealed. Right? We learn that this building, that we started the courtyard in is actually, it's kind of strangely shaped, and we learned that it was actually built by the Nazis during their occupation of the Netherlands during World War II, right? And we learned why and what they were using the site for and how it was altered after the war, etc., right? We learn more and more about this school, which is to say, really, that there's narrative content here, historical narrative content. This isn't just a dry exercise in scalar shifts or scalar jumps, right? Okay, so here by the sixth image, we see a map of the Netherlands, right? And the accompanying text here points out feature after feature of this, right? Here we see the central part of the Netherlands. This is a quote. The small square in the middle, of course, shows the town of Utrecht, and the tiny square inside is the twice reduced picture of illustration 4, right, which happened 2 pages earlier. This is Bilthoven, and there is the little girl. We know she must be there, but we cannot see her, unquote. Now, the text's point is seemingly mundane. Of course, we can no longer see the girl. We're looking at a map of the whole country. But the implication for scale jumping media is significant. The book has set up a material scalar relationship between the resolution of the paper and ink droplets, the area of the image's frame, 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters, and the dimensions of the surface that each image describes, the courtyard, the girl, the Netherlands, etc., right? Here, Boca is asserting that the girl is in the picture, even though we can't see her, right? This is a radical claim, of which we can only make sense in relation to the dynamics of resolution and the scalar relationship between two surfaces. If we go looking for the girl that the text asserts is in the image, right, we can get as close as we want and magnify this, but we'll find that the ink droplets on the, eventually, far beyond the resolution of this webcam, right, we will find that the ink droplets on the page cannot resolve the girl in question because the amount of detail that they can register in a given area of paper is less than that required to code any recognizable detail of the student into the paper fibers, right, given this field of view or medial scalar ratio. Nonetheless, the girl continues to exist on the surface described by the book. She is in the picture by dint of the retentive capacity, or we might say narrative capacity, of the reader's mind. Resolution in cosmic view is highlighted by, or highlighted as a material property or relationship between two scales. The scale of the book in the reader's hands and the scale of the surface that each page depicts. The reader, given the affordances of the ink and paper fibers, must negotiate the scalar relationship initiated by each page. What is in the picture and what isn't? What can be retained even though it can no longer be resolved? The process of scale jumping becomes both material and serialized. The reader must work within the material limitations of resolution and the discontinuity between scales, yet generate virtual connectives between these scalar slices of the cosmos. Narrative connections between dynamics at different scales. Just because we cannot resolve detail given a particular medial relationship does not mean that no detail exists. It's always part of the scalar spectrum, but not ready to hand. All right. This book then gifts us a critical insight about scalar mediation's relationship to ecology, or the differentiated detail contained in any milieu. As we negotiate jumps across ever greater scales, our field of view changes while the resolving power of our media remains the same. Thus, field of view and resolvable detail are inversely proportional. The larger the area we represent, the less detail we can see. And this basic equation cannot be circumvented no matter how much we increase the resolution of our media, right? The apprehension of scale will always be a negotiation of difference between two or more surfaces, even if those surfaces are topologically complex, i.e. three-dimensional. cosmic view, by rendering visible the apparatus of scalar mediation itself, enrolls its readers in a drama of resolution. Every time I turn a page, a new relationship has to be negotiated between the scale of the book and the scale of the surface it describes, the planet Earth, the galaxy, a white blood cell, etc. Thus, we could say that one definition of scale is the negotiation of difference between two or more medial surfaces. So I'm going to bring back the screen share. To give you this, hopefully, maybe handy definition, one possible definition of scale. I would not want to claim it as the exclusive definition of scale. Just one that I've found particularly helpful. Okay, so resolving, I should also say that I want to claim that this is true for any context in which we evoke scale. So this is a thought experiment. If you want to think about different ways that we use scale and whether or not this definition applies, my argument is that it does, even in contexts that are not, maybe so obvious, even conceptual contexts, for instance, the scalar politics or scalar rhetoric that I mentioned, because in these cases, sometimes the surfaces are virtual, but they nonetheless are real, to evoke a Bergsonian Deleuzian distinction. Okay, so resolving differences between surfaces is one of the primary operations of media. I want to go further, though. Reading cosmic view as a drama of resolution, wherein certain details are available to us at each scale that by necessity disappear at every other scale, suggests that scale is also a narrative dynamic. And what both of these formulations suggest is that while scale is a fundamental form of ontological difference, it is also a significant form of cultural production. Right? This is the sort of productive side of the scalar paradox. Each entails the other. We discipline our knowledge into stabilized scales, but thereby uncover ontological scalar difference in the form of continually surprising and often disruptive ecological detail. Whether that's the double helix of DNA, increasing atmospheric greenhouse gases, or the intergalactic cosmic web. Again, we make scales, but scale unmakes us. Scale is a relational measure. To refer to a particular scale is to refer to a pre-stabilized size domain that has been mediated in relation to some other surface. Right, in my cosmic view example, the surface of the page, but equally the scale of the perceiving body, which we might intuitively understand as that which can be directly encountered through touch, and so on. A scale only emerges in relation to other scales or surfaces. This is why I emphasize that encounter is a primary dynamic of scale. It is impossible to inhabit only one scale, which is to say that it is impossible to live an unmediated existence. Scalar politics, as I mentioned previously, is actually about adjudicating relative scalar value, which regions of the scalar spectrum are important or central, and which valueless or peripheral or inert. Which connections in a scalar network are vital, which accessible, and which agential. These are the sorts of questions scalar politics attempts to strategically answer and then foreclose further debate, of course. In order to accomplish this successfully, not single scales, but collections of scales, entire regions of the scalar spectrum must be characterized and a model presented for how they fit together into a scalar network. This is the ideological work of the zoom. The zoom is a technique of scalar constellation. It articulates multiple scales together and characterizes their interconnections and relative levels of accessibility in order to paint a scalar picture of reality. Zooms can be purely conceptual or expressed in any medium, but in the mid to late 20th century, the most mesmerizing and influential ones took the form of time-based media that approximated literal zooms. The most famous cosmic zoom of all time is, of course, Charles and Ray Eames's Powers of 10, published in 1977, but based on their earlier film Rough Sketch from 1968. Both are adaptations of Krysztoforska's Cosmic View, the book. Let's just take a moment to look at the 1977 film, which I'm sure you've all seen. But we're going to kind of play this in the background here. There's so much that can be said about this film that I devote almost 2 chapters to it in my book, and it sort of even then sort of permeates the entire study in various forms. But here I want to highlight just a couple of elements. First, you'll note that the blue boxes clearly delineate the boundaries of each resolving cut. Each is a defined scale. We are not, as viewers, traveling through the cosmos, but rather traversing scales. While for Bokeh, each page represented a new scalar relationship with the reader. Here we're made to feel as if our scalar relationship to the reference surfaces are in fact fully dynamic. This is to say that we don't feel like we are stabilizing scalar relationships at all. It is as if we are taking in all of these scales as a unified whole. That's the mesmeric power of this film and its lasting legacy. It makes us feel like there's one single unified surface to the cosmos. But of course, we aren't taking in the scalar spectrum in toto, right? We're looking at 41 individual resolving cuts that have been strung together to mimic an optical zoom with a simulated transition between them. We aren't actually zooming, much less moving through space. In fact, a huge animation stand is slowly tracking the camera closer to a static image, and then that image is strategically crossfaded with another in which the camera is reset and repeats the camera movement, right? No new ecological detail is resolved during these simulated zooming movements. Rather, a new detail is revealed at critical thresholds when the image surface is swapped, right? And this is not simply a limitation of analog media, right? The same holds true for digital systems like Google Earth. If you try to zoom too quickly, the seams between pre-stabilized scales and the illusory traversals between them will become readily apparent, right? You can create a purely digital simulation that appears to sort of infinitely zoom without predefined surfaces, but that's sort of a separate argument. Right, because those make no claims about direct representation of actual surfaces. So that's a different discussion in the book. Okay, so here the crossfade serves to temporarily occlude these new details and simulate their progressive revelation, enhancing the feeling of moving between scales, but doing nothing to actually traverse scalar difference. Scalar difference inheres entirely in the image plates, not in the simulated movement. The movement is entirely illusory and non-scalar, but that's only the beginning of its problems. Despite evoking duration, it belies temporal scale, as if scale were purely a visual and spatial dynamic. Scalar difference requires, I'd argue, that the temporal scale of an action in one region of the scalar spectrum is always distinct from the temporal scale of a commensurate action in another region. In this case, the amount of time it would take to traverse the distance between any two of the film's scales would always vary. If it takes 10 seconds to move from the first scale, 10 to the first meters, to the second scale, then it would take millions of years to traverse the distance of some of these later scales, right? Unless our speed varied as well. But it only takes 12 scales before we would need to be traveling faster than the speed of light, an impossibility. The filmmakers produce the illusion of a smooth zoom over many scales by keeping the time between them constant. It's always 10 seconds, right? But that's related to the bodily scale or the visual scale of the viewer, and not in any way to the supposed milieus that we're traversing. This enforced non-scalar continuity expressed as a linear, uniform experience, especially in this sped up section, as we zoom back in, should remind us of Elon Musk's road to Mars, right? This is, as I said, an example of scalar collapse. Scalar collapse is the speculative combination of scales within one reference surface that elides the differences between them. If we think of each scale, each cut in the scalar spectrum stabilized in relation to a subject, as a milieu of common events and potential encounters, then it is clear that by collapsing temporal scalar difference, the sorts of events that Eames's lead us to consider are vastly truncated. In fact, they are largely reduced to passive encounter, as if during an amusement park ride on rails. One of the things that fascinated me when I studied the making of these cosmic zooms was the degree to which the scientific and filmmaking teams behind them debated these problems and agonized over various methods of animating scalar change, which is to say that this was a very, very deliberate and well-researched form of media. They had multiple consultants, scientific consultants, etc. This film took about 5 years to make. It was a laborious process that involved lots and lots of back and forth between the participants and research that was done to try to decide how scale could be represented. Right, and so I want to say that as problematic as I find this film, these problems were not unremarked upon by some members of the team that eventually maybe didn't fully win out. Although there's a fascinating story here that I relate in the book about these sort of clashes between different members of these teams that made these films that got expressed in sort of paradoxical ways. So you can actually trace the philosophical conflict in the films themselves, in tensions between, for instance, aspects of the narration and aspects of the visuals, etc. To me, it's fascinating to do that work because it reveals how the construction of scale and not merely the experience of the final product is relevant to our understanding of scalar difference. One of the exhilarating things about these films is that they seem to bring the entire scalar spectrum within grasp, right? They allow us a sort of aggregation of a complete constellation of scales, each articulated to the others in various ways through depicted events, through dynamics that span from one to another, and through narrativized characterization. Their mesmeric formula, then, is to provide the illusion of equal access but unequal value. This is the hallmark of scalar ideology. When dealing with highly ideological yet also highly mesmeric media, I think it's important to find new ways to visualize it to aid analysis, right? You have to find a way to remediate, to essentially strip away the mesmerism and reveal the dynamics in play. Right? And one way to revisualize Powers of 10 is to look not at the progressive roller coaster of transscalar traversal, but rather the larger constellation of its scales that it produces. Sorry. I'm going to skip this. This is the original film from 1968 where they made an attempt to actually visualize temporal scale by including these relativity clocks that would actually show how two temporal scales diverge as you do this cheat, with this 10-second between scale cheat. But they dropped this in the later film, with again great internal controversy. And in any case, there were problems even with this model because of relativity, and they run up against this speed of light problem here. Okay, so this is a network graph of all 41 scales that are each bounded box within the film. And here I've spread them out, right? So we remove the animation and look at each one of those scales in relation to all of the other scales. And these relationships are produced both by visual cues and by direct explanatory narration within the film. So I aggregated these together and mapped the interrelationships between all of these different stabilized scales. And I think the picture that emerges here is really interesting, and not this picture of this kind of every scale having this equal visual distance from us, right, in the film. Actually, they're unequally characterized, right? That's what I was trying to say. This is one way to visualize that divergence. Right, we can see here, for instance, that these, I hope you can see my cursor. So you can see these inner, the atomic scale are some of the most highly interconnected scales in terms of their connections to other scales, right? So if we network graph this and analyze it in terms of centrality, we can see that the most central of all scales in this particular film, rhetorically, are the atomic scales. And this actually had to do with the influence of Philip Morrison, who was the narrator and wrote most of most of the drafts of the narration, and had his own ideological crusade here that was very different from Charles Eames's, for instance. And a lot of clash between them in the making of this film. Real bias against certain scales. He hated quarks, for instance, and found them really disturbing, and didn't really want to fully believe in them. But he loved atoms, and felt that atoms were the most important sort of scalar center point of the universe. Whereas for Charles and Ray Eames, the molecular, I want to say the molecular DNA and human body, that scale of expression, of genetic expression into body, into phenotype, was for them central. And so you can actually see this here, because I've also colored green in this graph scales that are represented within the film as containing intrascalar dynamics, which is to say scales in which things happen, in which processes are described, in which we could say a sort of ecological understanding is presented by the film. And other scales are presented as completely inert, right? Which is just to say that a lack of any description of process or dynamism or vitality in any way. So you can see this conflict play out. You can see that the Eameses got their characterization of this vital region of the scalar spectrum into the film up here, whereas the Morrisons, Phyllis was Philip's partner, and they did work together on the research of the film, though Philip wrote the actual narration. You can see that they got their centrality in, but less of a characterization of vitality, right? So you can see this sort of tensions at work in this film, and you can see a kind of scalar ideology that emerges, right? I just want to say that ideology is multiplicitous. Okay, taking a little too much time on this, so I'm going to keep moving forward. But just as a quick comparison, and I find that visualizing interrelationships between scales as larger constellations in a network graph form is particularly useful when you're comparing different works. So I do that a lot in the book. This is Rough Sketch, the film, the earlier film. And you can see here that the most central scale here is the human body. This is before Philip Morrison came into the picture and wrote the script for the second film. So you can kind of see how parts of this project end up ideologically represented in the later film, and other parts are revised. So this is particularly interesting, but we're going to move on. I want to say, though, that what this allows us to do is characterize parts of the scalar spectrum as particularly vital, and other parts as particularly inert. You can see clusters here, right? This is what one of the points I want to make is it's not just individual scales that are characterized in a certain way. It's the interrelationship between scales and regions of the scalar spectrum that become the sort of grist for the ideological work of the zoom, whether it's a literal zoom or conceptual zooms of different kinds. Okay. I'm going to skip this, although what happened is when Charles Eames died, his wife Ray Eames and Philip Morrison collaborated. They took all the images from the film and remediated them into a book for Scientific American, very popular book. And using the exact same scales, literally the same scales and same images, they totally remediated it to try to fix some of the ideological problems with that, at least in Philip Morrison's view of the film. It's a sort of an apology, right, of sorts, and an attempt to sort of fix the wrong. Anyway, this is actually a whole grouping of different cosmic zooms that I aggregated together just to give you a sense of how radically different. All these use the same, for instance, network graphing algorithm without manipulation on my part to look at these different works. You can see that every one of them produces a radically different view of the universe. I want to say that this is a view of reality, right? This is a scalar conception of reality, each one of these, right? And insofar as they are influential works of media, they have radically influenced how we actually view the world. Okay. So the linear road model of scalar constellation produces a mesmeric sense of equal access to all scales, initiating a collapse of scalar difference while at the same time differentially characterizing or valuing the scales it resolves. So I want to suggest that a second way to model the zoom is through the model of the figure of the zoetrope. Right? The zoetrope was an early pre-cinematic optical device for viewing animation. Right? A circular image strip here it was placed inside a drum with viewing slits, right, and then spun around, right? And the result was a moving image composite. Right? We're kind of fixing our view through these slits. And it's it's kind of, instead of feeling like we're looking at a strip of separate images, it feels like we're looking at one composite moving image. All right, when we constellate scales through the zoom, we enter the illusion of a subjective movement through scales, right? A subject traveling. They call this the traveler in the film, in their films, the Eames's films. In fact, however, what we are actually witnessing is a movement of objects in front of a subject. In other words, the scalar spectrum is resolved into distinct scales, which are then arranged or animated in a circle like a zoetrope. Only we as viewing subjects and human agents occupy the central position, right? Inward looking out, as it were. The zoom provides a window into a constellation of circularly arranged scales while producing the illusion of movement through the cosmos. Viewed this way, I hope we can see how insidious this actually is. Each scale in our encounter appears to be equally accessible to us. The entire constellation is equidistant from our subject position. Each scale as a milieu of affordances for encounter is reduced to a potential surface of intervention or colonization. We are no longer a part of the scalar spectrum, but its gravitational center. I started by noting that our contemporary era is marked by an uncritical scale mania, an exuberance for all things transscalar. In some ways, this is a good thing, as it's driving a renewed interest in scale from academic researchers, as exhibited by, of course, this lovely gathering. Wherever a greater sensitivity can be cultivated to the surprise of scale, the emergence of unexpected ecological detail, that is certainly to be celebrated and encouraged. The wonders of scalar difference are the greatest prize on offer. But unfortunately, they're also subject to this collapse of difference, to exploitation, to instrumentalization, to colonization. They can end up acting as supports for an enlargement of the subject rather than its transscalar distribution. Scale is no panacea. It is dangerous, mysterious, and vital. Scale represents, to me, a kind of sensitivity or literacy that we need to mindfully cultivate. I want to end then with an example of ways that scale theory can be generatively applied to navigating the cosmos. I think it's important that if theory is going to help us at all, that it be practically applicable. So I want to give this example from my own life. Another project of mine. I was thinking of a number of different projects I could talk about here, and I could talk about more in the Q&A if you're interested, because I've tackled this from a number of different perspectives, but I wanted to choose one here. So for the past 8 years, I've worked on an experimental architecture project to imagine a dwelling that breaks the cycle of capital's scales. So I'm building this with my family as a retreat for artists, writers, and thinkers. I wanted to start from scratch and completely rethink what a dwelling could look like and accomplish. After a great deal of research into various building materials, design considerations, and use cases, I realized that I needed a guiding principle to align all of these decisions, and settled on, you guessed it, scale. The two principles that I've followed ever since on this particular project are: first, that the structure must elementally integrate with the processes that comprise its environment. And second, that the structure will be built for a moment 250 years in the future and meant to last at least 500 years. Both of these scalar principles turn out to fly in the face of architecture as we know it, right? They in some ways apply to retrospective architecture because there are structures from the past that we can analyze in these ways. But in terms of our current present, this is not how anyone thinks about architecture, right? This is not how people think about architecture as future oriented. That is, there's a particular unspoken scale to our current architectural imaginary. It's driven by the scale of the human lifespan, the scales of capital, our conception of agency, our operative environmental scales, and basic inertia. When we design a building, we name the immediate needs and concerns, and consider a very small spatial scale surrounding it, and maybe an even smaller temporal scale. And we optimize the design to match those micro scale dynamics. That's why the average building in the US lasts about 40 years before it's demolished. Okay, so at its heart, I see this short-sightedness as a response, not to larger timescales that are unknown, but to a presumption that they are known, that the future will fundamentally be like the present. And this is the inductive fallacy that David Hume railed against, so it's nothing new. But when we acknowledge that it is fundamentally a form of scalar collapse, we can see the problem in a new light. 250 years in the future is extremely difficult for us to meaningfully characterize in a predictive mode. Just ask my collaborators on this project who think I'm nuts. Will the future look like Musk's pseudo-50s techno-utopia? Or will it look like a desolate climate wasteland? Will the chief problem be nuclear winter, fascist oppression, or which planet to visit for your dinner date? We're so uncomfortable with this scale of decision-making that it immediately changes the framing of design decisions. When you don't know what the future needs will be, but must design for them, and that was the conceptual project here, you start to think less about specifics and more about scale itself. So I'll say that this project isn't finished yet, but to give you, it's getting close. But to give you an idea, here's a rough video of the work in progress during a build session last winter. We know that we won't have today's climate in 250 years. We know that we can't count on an endless supply of energy to change the environment within the home. So the domes are self-regulating, remaining cool in the summer without any energy input due to being buried under over 130 tons of soil from the site. They're warmed by passive solar gain in the winter due to their orientation. Large glass panels let in the sunlight and heat the interior for most of the day. But that sun is blocked during the summer. A complete hydronic system circulates water throughout the floor, hot water tank, and the exterior of the domes, where solar thermal collectors superheat the water. This is where we were right there. Those are the solar collectors, right? And transfer its energy inside. The system produces nearly unlimited thermal energy by running only a single 60-watt pump. Solar PV produces a significant surplus of electrical surplus as well, though those solar panels are not on top of the building itself. It'll soon collect and store rainwater as well to supplement its well. The domes are fully integrated into their Northern California environment. They contain only a single shared wall that you see here. Everything else is a continuous curve. There's no delineation between a wall and a ceiling for most of the house. So there are a few partition walls in one of the domes. There's no roof. The house is literally a hill. Wild grasses grow over its crest. A buck deer, a wild turkey, and a cute chipmunk have all moved in and lived on top of the domes. Inside, its continuous curves bounce sunlight far more efficiently and completely than rectilinear walls. The entire structure inside is bathed in light and organic form. No fences, walls, or other barriers keep everything at bay. The interior is selectively permeable with the exterior, but this is the only membrane, actual or conceptual, in the larger environment of the site. They do not attempt, like most buildings, to create a resolving cut, producing a separate scale from their surrounding environment. This is most radical with regard to California's fire ecology. The domes are designed to exist within that fire ecology, not to try to keep it at bay. The structure is 95% natural hill, and thus cannot be destroyed by fire. Instead of building massive fire barriers and relying on fighting any fire that threatens it, the vision of the house is that it has been designed to burn. Though I will say, with selective features protected from severe damage by automatic emergency sprinklers, right? So there's a smart aspect to this. But to our great surprise and dismay, this was actually tested very early on in 2017, when a fire burned through the mountain where the domes are located, burning 90% of all the homes in the entire mountain. This is a picture from my parents' house, which is up the ridge. You probably saw it in the wider shots of that video. Up the ridge, they took this photo looking across the ridge. You can see this rain of embers and the fire moving through the area. This was in the middle of the night, and this fire wasn't even battled by firefighters. It vastly outscaled any potential effort to fight it. The domes were unattended and burned for 3 hours before someone, my father, made it to the site to check on them. And despite some damage to the front wall, this is looking down at the domes here. So this is you can see the burning. So the actual main damage to the domes was caused, ironically, by some wooden scaffolding that was there for their construction, and not the final thing. This caused some damage, but besides that damage, the domes emerged amazingly, fully intact. And though the land was scarred, it is certainly recovering. So the domes are an experiment in transscalar thinking. How to think the impossible longue durée, not as an idle thought experiment, but as practical action. And this sort of thinking can take two forms. Long-term multi-generational goals, and these are very difficult to pursue with continuity, or a recursive model. And the domes are meant to be a little bit of both. I'm trying to lay the groundwork for a project that implicitly spans generations, right? But I'm also filtering the small scale through the large. That is, I'm living and dwelling and creating in this moment. But this moment looks different when it appears from the perspective of the transscalar future. My design criteria are not based on presentist assumptions, what I have or need, or the climate today, but rather fit within a world both larger and smaller than mine, a millennial timescale, and the singularity of a particular location and environment. It's the articulation of these scales together that has produced a new perspective for me. I don't disappear as a subject, but rather appear anew as the inhabitant of an environment, as a participant in a transscalar drama. This encounter is not me traveling through other scales as a cosmic zoom, but much more as other scales resolving me. In the book, I call this the recursive self. It's a scale-aware self, not enlarged or expanded, but re-encountered from other scales and as other scales. Whether as a speck on a strange hilltop, or as an aggregation from a database query, or as a single uttered phrase, this is the most I hope for as we all encounter the multiscalar future. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Zach. What a fantastic way to start off the conference. Also, really exciting to have this kind of practice as well, coming together with the theory that's going on there. Do you mind just taking your yeah? And so I can. Excellent. I'll just add myself in there. So we will open the floor in a second to take some audience questions, but I hope you don't mind me asking a couple of questions before we do so. I wanted to ask whether you could just say a little bit more about one or two bits, in particular, this kind of connection between different forms of scalar collapse that you talk about in that kind of third part. So you talk about the sort of cosmic zoom representations like rough sketch and powers of 10 as giving us this sort of unhelpful idea of being liberated from scalar difference as kind of a sort of exemplary kind of scalar collapse. And I was wondering, how does that sort of map beyond cinema or literature, depending on whether we're talking about the films or the books? So like, do you see the politics of scalar constellation, which we see in these cinematic representations, as fully analogous with other forms of scalar collapse? Or do we need to be more careful to distinguish the precise politics, the precise sort of scalar ideology of every scalar constellation?
Great, wonderful question. Thank you, Oliver. So the reason that I tackled cosmic zooms as a particular form of media was not meant to explicate or engage only that form of media. So I do want to say that partially, so the answer is a little bit of both, I think, to your question. That I do think that these forms are analogous to other forms of scalar collapse in some ways, but I also think that the particulars of both their construction and their scalar ideologies, of course, has to be attended to. So one thing I want to say is that mediation here, I don't want to limit that to any particular set of forms of media, right? As I said, I think that that we could think about, presidential debates, or we could think about parliamentary debates, or we could think about wars. Like we could, take an example of the war in Ukraine, right? Here, this is a war to a large extent about scale, which is to say that scale is weaponized in this war, right? Putin's argument is essentially that Ukraine doesn't constitute a legitimate country. In other words, it's not a scale. That it's not legitimate to make a resolving cut at a national scale, right? And instead, Ukraine is part of a larger scale and must be resolved only at that larger scale of a sort of larger Russian empire, essentially, right? And he has this yes, exactly, right. So Putin is basically arguing for and attempting to enact, right, a particular scalar, a particular resolving cut, and Zelensky and Ukraine are attempting to make a different resolving cut. And so as this plays out in international media, right, as a conversation and as a set of requests for international aid, right, the actual weapons and the economics of this conflict are largely determined by the intermeshing of both of those forces within much larger economic forces on one hand, and on literally street by street fighting on the other, right? So there's a scalar intermeshing here that where the ideology, the ideological conflict directly impacts the weapons that those soldiers have in the streets, right? So to me, there's this interrelationship, this permeability of the scales. It's all about what scalar cuts are made, and this is entirely political, right? But it's political in a way with real concrete multi-scalar implications. So I just use that as an example to try to answer your question by saying this dynamic occurs across all media and with completely different stakes and different dynamics that are particular to the scalar, to the scales being stabilized and the interrelationships between them. So there isn't one, I don't think there's one monolithic or hegemonic scalar ideology. And in fact, I think all of the different cosmic zooms I look at, I try to suggest that characterize each one as a very different ideological platform that each one is advancing, right? And in the sort of the real world outside of that, it's exactly the same.
So in a sense, you'd almost say that if we were to take your example of the invasion of Ukraine, depending on where you looked at it and the way in which that was mediated, you would be able to create different network graphs in the same of those sort of ideological presentations of the scale in the same way that you did with the different cosmic zooms in your book. Yes, and so I invite and hope that others take up this methodology. I certainly don't want any monopoly over it. That was my hope, right? By generating a way of stripping away the mesmerism and finding a way to analyze these works, I hope that similar methods can be used, for far different forms of media. I should say that I created a platform to do this. It's something that hasn't been really, that I haven't really fully made use of or advertised, even though it's existed for a couple of years, and that is an online platform that allows users to upload image sets, and then it will network graph them for you. You enter the metadata, and I've tested this and had students, we've done sort of test runs of different films, for instance, and novels. The one requirement is that you can produce images for the different scales, but for instance, I had students who would sketch images for different scales that appear in a work of literature, for instance. Right. So I tried to create a tool that actually would enable and help this to be done. And I haven't sort of invited enough people in to actually make use of it. If anyone's interested in it, though, let's,
please come in and let's do something. It's slated for future, expansion. I'll give.
If you like, we can happily send it around to people afterwards if you'd like to send it over.
I will put
Sounds
it.
like your classes are fantastic.
I'll put it in the. Wait a minute. I have to double check myself the URL, but I'll put it in the chat. But first, before I do something dumb, I'm going to check that I got the domain right. Is it .com or is it?
Always a tricky question.
That right. Gosh. Okay, I've got it wrong. All right, I will just have to circulate it in the future.
No problem. Like I say, we can happily send that around to everyone if you'd like. It's actually really interesting that you jumped straight into the question of politics, to go all the way from the cosmic zoom to politics, because one of the things that I also found quite interesting, you didn't mention it in the talk, but it kind of comes out a little bit, is when in the book, when you're talking about like what is scale, you have this kind of tripartite thing of talking about ontological determinism, but then the other two being ethical ground and a set of political tactics. So this idea of like two different ways of the many that you talk about, but of kind of framing scale. And so this idea of like ethics and politics and how that factors into or kind of intersects with the ideas of scale that you're talking about. I was wondering whether you could perhaps speak to that a little bit more as well.
Right. Well, in terms of the, what I say is that scale, sort of functions in these three different modes. And I think that the as political tactics, that's hopefully what I've been trying to develop here a bit in this talk. I really mean that. I really want also others to sort of jump in with other examples. But I think the entire history of colonialism, for instance, also in its neo-colonial modes, and imperialism are scalar tactics, right? And I sort of use the invasion of Ukraine as an example as a sort of stand in also for larger imperial and colonial projects. But of course, this isn't to say that scale is always evoked as a colonial project. Scale, of course, can be invoked for many other political projects as well. It's sort of telling that scale is the political battleground for the history of for capital, in the history of capital, but also in the history of communism, right? Both are essentially making, both essentially function as a set of scalar dynamics and scalar tactics, right? In that conflict. If capitalism has been more successful, it's that capitalism has developed, I think, a more potent set of scalar tactics, basically. It's highly effective. But we can also look at, if we want to go back further, we can look at religion. We can look at religious contestations, right, as a form of scalar tactics as well. One piece of a future project, of a collaborative project that I'm working toward is a sort of exploration of narrative and scale in many different media. And one of the things I want to look at is the Protestant Reformation as a narrative battle, right? As a sort of narrative contestation with scale as its primary dynamics. Now, the third thing you mentioned, the sort of ethical elements, I think that's maybe the most challenging and nebulous thing to describe, and I think it's also the least developed in my book, because it's really meant for future work, for others or me or both or whatever, right? To think about what that might mean. But I think that this dome project that I just talked about is, for me at least, an entree into thinking about ethics of scale. So this is very important to me, but it's also something very difficult to argue. And I never want to try to over theorize ethics. And so there's a kind of complicated meta argument around that as well. So for me, I actually want to try to explore scalar ethics in a more applied way. But anyway, I would love for others to let me know what sort of ethical dilemmas or precepts or guides scale might provide in different contexts.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you finished with that, because I suppose I've got like final question kind of exactly brings in this idea of like sort of what does scale provide us in terms of a sort of practical way forward. And I was really struck in your book by a phrase that you sort of take from Rob Nixon about slow violence, where you say, and I quote, "Slow violence is not accidental. It is the result of weaponized scalar difference." And so I was wondering, you've got this idea of slow violence as a kind of like how damaging processes are elided by categorizing them within other scales. It's kind of scalar collapse, if I understood it correctly. And I was wondering, on the flip side, do you see any ways of positively weaponizing scalar difference? I suppose I'm obviously thinking about climate change and as the sort of big scalar challenge, or one of the big scalar challenges of today. Sort of, is there a productive rather than a destructive politics of scalar difference? I suppose that's kind of the question I'm getting at.
Sure, great question. Although I would follow Foucault and suggest that the destructive and the productive are not necessarily divergent, right? That in fact, that's why capitalism utilizes scale and weaponizes it so effectively is through the productive aspects of scale, despite their destructive nature.
Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah,
with
definitely.
that caveat, I would say that I want to say that I mean, most of the examples I've talked about really are countering, like counter narratives or counter scales to these more destructive processes. I think this question, for instance, though, I'll take one example. I'm trying to think of what a productive example would be. One of the things I talk about in the book, and is really kind of interesting and dear to me, is the question of big data, the relationship between database and algorithm, for instance. And I think that big data is sort of, one of along with, I say this toward the beginning of the book, that big data and climate change are the two greatest challenges of the 21st and 22nd centuries, right? Like these are the battlegrounds. These are the biggest scalar battlegrounds, and in some ways, if we hope to come out with a better future, or let's say survive, if we hope to survive as a species, stakes are pretty high. Like we need to grapple with these. We need to understand the scalar dynamics of these two forces, and of course many others in between. But those two forces structure so much else, right? When it comes to environmental justice and social justice, it's all going to be squeezed between those two things, between climate change and big data, right? And that squeeze is I mean, basically what I think is going to be the exciting and terrifying sort of apocalyptic battle of the future, right? And because it's all about scalar dynamics and scalar politics, that's what we need to hone as our skills. That said, how do we turn those things to our advantage, right? And so how do we given that context, produce positive features? And I want to do that. I don't want to just be out on the battlefield, right? We have to actually articulate positive futures and positive structures that escape these dynamics. But to do that, they must utilize those dynamics, right? You can't escape and ignore something. You have to find ways to turn it on its head. And so, the domes is one example about climate change, right? How does climate change, how might climate change our relationship to each other and to various scales and to environment, right? That could be done in a productive way, even within the sort of terror of climate change. Similarly, in our kind of datafied future, there are ways that can be utilized productively, right? And I don't just mean instrumentalized in small term ways. I mean that I talk about in this final chapter of the book, I talk about how database how I see database as being completely dehumanizing and the sort of basis of the sort of basis for big data, right? I mean, the like algorithm doesn't mean anything without database, right? And so I'm trying to refocus us a bit on database, even though algorithm is the sexy thing. And my suggestion there, and I really believe this, is that database identity and database driven media can be utilized to produce new forms of subjectivity.
Mhm.
So it's not just that this is going to oppress us, which it already does and will continue to do, but there's there are other trajectories, right? And there's something actually really interesting, and this is why I developed this idea of the recursive self. The recursive self can find itself through database, right? We are so fundamentally datafied. If you find a way, if you cultivate practices that enable you to approach other scales, that to resolve other scales, including, and you utilize the database as a sort of foundation, right? For that kind of inquiry, that kind of transscalar exploration, you find that you can find yourself, right? Or you find analogies to yourself in ways that are really interesting. You discover, for instance, that you're in groups, you're in assemblages that weren't possible without database aggregation. The database query, and I mean that both literally and in a kind of larger metaphorical sense, is an aggregation of small scale attributes, right? The database query takes one set of attributes out of a total identity, for instance, and aggregates them together, and surprising things can result. In other words, just like in any form of more traditional media, when you make a scalar cut and then follow it, right, new entities emerge, new ecological detail. Well, that ecological detail can include aggregations of, for instance, characteristics of individuals that now appear not as individuals, but as aggregated characteristics. And that's a new way to see yourself. That's a new collective. In other words, new collectives can form that aren't based on the standard affective connections between stabilized individual identities. That's, to me, is really exciting, right? When you can start to see yourself as smaller scale, but also see yourself as larger scale because of these new conceptual entities that emerge when you make new resolving cuts.
That's a really fascinating way of thinking about it. Yeah, yeah. I see we actually have quite a few questions. So I will turn to those. I noticed that I've got at least 3 questions that sort of come around this idea of cinema. So I'm just going to group a few from Beth Bullock, Lawrence Kent, and Sasha Crawford Holland, and then perhaps you could talk to those at the same time. Perhaps there's a question of, like, when you talk about cuts, the resolving cut, is that so purposefully sort of evoking cinema, or is that a kind of happy accident? There's a kind of question about the zoetrope, and is, like, this idea of the zoetrope something quite kind of particular, so a special case of scalar division, or is that something like is that the condition of film itself, with 24 frames a second and things like that? And then sorry to throw them all in, I thought, and then there's this idea of so Sasha is saying it's difficult for him to imagine being able to grasp all of your arguments or be able to think critically about scale at all without a recourse to the visual, or even conceptualizing scale in relation to other sense modalities. So is there something kind of inherent about scale and visuality going on there? So I think there's a few connections there, but I hope you can unwrap those. Yeah.
Okay, great questions. So to take the first one, the idea of the cut. So I am a filmmaker, and I actually, before I went back to academia, worked as a filmmaker in Hollywood, though doing independent film, not Hollywood films. So there's I think there's probably no doubt that has influenced my thinking here. But more explicitly, the idea of the cut for me is borrowing and building on Karen Barad's notion of the agential cut. And the agential cut comes out of she develops out of Niels Bohr's ideas in quantum mechanics, this suggestion that in some ways, like this is about the differentiation of matter and energy, the way that it internally produces its own difference. Right. So this is a kind of this is basically Niels Bohr and Deleuze kind of filtered together through a kind of feminist science studies, produces this really, I think, brilliant book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, that really influenced me here. So she does use the word cut to describe this, and I believe actually that Bohr uses the word cut as well. So essentially, this is coming from quantum mechanics, and what I'm interested in doing is expanding that to understanding scalar differentiation. And I'm partly arguing that they're one and the same thing, that any differentiation has to be a scalar differentiation, right? It'd be a very, very special case when you would differentiate, when you have a cut or a separation between two entities or surfaces where there isn't a scalar difference. So that's maybe getting into the weeds a bit, but so I don't mean this to be specific to cinema or even time-based media in general, or even visual media to get into the other question, right? And so I think I see it as more fundamental than that. I see it as the differentiation of literally time, matter and energy itself, right? And as all forms of differentiation involve temporal and spatial difference, scalar difference, right? This is a kind of intensive, as an intensive dynamic, the differentiation has to involve scale. This is not described by Broad or a Bohr, right? And so there's not a focus on scale, and I think that's what I'm trying to contribute to this, is that that works at every other scale. The scalar spectrum is essentially, again, this kind of virtual difference that requires a cut before scale emerges, right, as a relationship. Okay, so, but the cut in cinema is really interesting, right? And it's actually especially interesting that in these cosmic zooms, cutting is noticeably absent, right? Or I should say it's occluded. The cuts are all occluded very deliberately, right? And that's important ideologically. So actually one of them, right, the zoom is another affordance of cinema. And even if this isn't a real zoom, it's obviously meant to mimic the optical zoom, right? I talk about the sort of invention of the zoom lens a little bit in the book. I'm interested in this as a visual modality that cinema develops, and in some ways runs through all cinema as a current. And there's a tension, of course, between the zoom and the cut. Right. And so that is deliberate. And I mean us to think about cinema, even though this is not meant to only apply to cinema, when I talk about cuts versus zooms. I'm particularly interested, for instance, in this future narrative book of graphic novels and comic books, because they explicitly make these cuts, right? Their temporality is cut in a way. That's fascinating, right? So as any form of change, especially visual change, is represented as a gap, whereas cinema can do that, and editing is I think the heart of cinema. But cinema can also occlude its own cuts, right? And that's why it becomes, and why the visual becomes the central way to argue for a certain form of scalar collapse, to make palatable and make it exciting and internalizable a certain form of scalar collapse. And so I think that it plays an important role in the history of scalar thinking, right? The visual is so fundamental to scalar thinking because it contains the affordances for the zoom. And this, right? Okay, so, but you have forms of the cosmic zoom that predate cinema, of course. You have You have these narratives in ancient Rome, for instance, right? And where you have Pax Romana, right? This concept, the scalar concept, right, of this kind of endless empire. That is actually, there's the dream of Scipio is this I talk about in the book is this work that it basically imagines a cosmic zoom, and it says like, wow, imagine that, now imagine that you float away from the earth and now you're out in the heavens, you're
Yeah.
looking down, and right, and when you do that, you realize that the Roman Empire is actually really tiny, right? So the relative scale is really interesting here. You think that the Roman Empire is the biggest thing there is, but there are other scalar perspectives that if we can imagine a kind of zoom out, we can see that it's actually small once we reach that other location, but it's still a zoom in that there's this implied continuity, right? So again, there's a scalar difference that emerges at the two ends when you say, oh, now I have this perspective and I'm comparing it to my pre-zoom perspective, right? And now we have two stabilized scales and we can see the difference between them. It emerges as a surprise, again, as a surprise, this kind of deflation of the Roman Empire. But the process in between them belied that difference, right? And suggested that it's possible to have a perspective that could be incorporated into the Roman ideology that actually manufactures a continuity between these, right? And you could say that is what's done in the future, right? As the Roman Empire transforms into the Holy Roman Empire, you actually do have this kind of continuity, a theological continuity that's grafted on, right? So anyway, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds there, but historically, you can see how the one can be folded into the other, right? The continuity of scale can be used to collapse scalar difference, and usually is, but it can also help us arrive at, if we can then make cuts, if we can then remake those cuts, right, into the zooms, we can move beyond that. So in that sense, it's pre-cinematic, it's post-cinematic, but the cinematic is I would say so persuasive in a particular visual domain of the zoom that it makes these larger conceptual zooms that predate it, so it's not necessary, but it certainly is sufficient to produce a kind of mesmeric smoothness between scales. Right?
Wow. Yeah, I see what you mean. Wow. So it's just so fascinating. I feel like you could go on and talk for this for another many hours. But I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up there. We have another panel. We have a panel starting on literature relatively shortly. So I would like to thank you once again from me. I'm sure our audience, if they were here, they would join me in thanking you once again for this super insightful presentation, and also for bringing in this kind of personal project of yours, and explaining all the ways in which scale factors into that. And I thought that was really great. So thank you once again. We will, for all of our audience, if you'd like to join us for the next panel, we'll be starting in about 20 minutes. That will be on literature. But for this panel, for this presentation, we say thank you once again to Zachary Horton, and we're going to finish there. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all for being here.